I would like to thank Per and Geos for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I try to take every opportunity I can get to talk about the work we do at the National Minerals Information Center. I think it's important work, and I am incredibly excited to be the director and have the opportunity to lead the organization in the 21st century. Being here in this auditorium brings back very fond memories for me. I used to lecture in an auditorium quite regularly at Universität Tübingen in Deutschland a long time ago after grad school. So it feels quite familiar and comfortable. I've forgotten all my German by now, but it does bring back pleasant memories. But I want to talk today about some of the factors that we look at when we think about criticality of minerals, particularly from a U.S. perspective. But I mean, our perspective in many ways is global, as I will describe. But it is a U.S. Centric kind of view. That's really my job. And so I'm going to describe to you some of the things that we're looking at and how we think about this whole issue of criticality and hopefully shed some light on how we do that. So I suppose many of you are familiar with the National Minerals Information Center. Some of you may not be. So I usually start by saying a bit about what our mission is and why we do what we do. We have a very simple mission, it's a very clear mission, and that is to collect, analyze, and disseminate information. We do that on domestic and international supply and demand of non-fuel minerals, so we don't do hydrocarbons, except a little bit in volume 3 of our yearbook series. But we focus on minerals and materials, of which there are many, that are essential to the U.S. economy and national security. That is our fundamental mission, and a lot of the work we do ends up being in direct support of the other government agencies that depend on our information for their own missions. We don't get to make policy. USGS is a scientific organization, and our job is to collect facts, analyze the data, provide fact-based information to policymakers so that they can make informed decisions on the basis of that information about how to ensure that the U.S. has an adequate supply of minerals and materials that meets its needs under a variety of different circumstances. So I like the fact that we have a very clear mission. It's a mission that we've been delivering for a long time in one form or another, not necessarily as the National Minerals Information Center, but the mandate to the USGS to sort of inventory, in a way, mineral resources goes back to the founding of the organization in 1879, the Organic Act, as it's called, which established the US Geological Survey. And it was established in large measure to try to understand what the mineral resources of the US were and how we might best access them. And it's gone through a number of different iterations over time. So organizationally, USGS created in the late 19th century, Bureau of Mines created early in the 20th century, some spin-offs to Department of Energy when the Department of Energy was created in the late 70s. In terms of the function of the information collection that we do, it started out in Bureau of Mines. The Bureau of Mines went to Interior, went to Commerce, went back to Interior. In 1995, the mineral information piece was returned back to Interior USGS because the US Bureau of Mines was eliminated. There's been endless arguments about whether that was a good idea ever since, but okay, I don't get to make policy, so I can't really comment on that. But the long history of information collection in the US means that we have data going all the way back to the year 1900. In fact, in our DS-140 data series, which some of you may have used, we've got information for production and consumption in the US going back all the way to 1900 for all of the commodities we cover, at least when we started covering them. Over time, we've covered more materials than we did in the past. But you can find all of this information, it's all publicly available, on our website, which I hope you will visit the next time you need to know about your favorite mineral. We have a very broad scope, as I think befits our role as an agency of the federal government. U.S. interests and economic interests and national security interests are quite broad. And so we cover a large portion of the periodic table in one way or another. as minerals or as metals or as elements, depending on the commodity that we're talking about. And periodically people will say, well, maybe we shouldn't bother covering this or that. And then 5 years later, we realize, well, it's really actually pretty important. So we resist the urge for people to sort of limit our scope. We believe it's important to look at things very broadly because our interests are broad. We have a very broad global scope as well. We cover more than 180 countries globally. Not all of them every year, but we pride ourselves on understanding mineral production and supplies and what's going on in the rest of the world as best we can. It's harder to get information from a lot of other countries, but it's important, and it's increasingly important, as I will talk about in a moment. We publish a lot, and you may have well seen some of our publications. We publish more than 700 publications a year. This is my principal job, in fact, to review and approve the final versions of these publications. So in my spare time, when I'm not traveling around to advisory boards and giving presentations, I'm reviewing publications in my office normally. So that's where you'll find me. But we have a yearbook series that's 6 books in 3 volumes. Each of these contains a commodity or a country chapter or a state chapter, depending on the volume, and they all are separate publications on our website. The mineral commodity summaries, the most recent version of which is here, just came out last week. The 2016 version is the earliest look at what happened in the US and globally in the mineral commodity world for the prior year. This is something that a lot of people look at and is eagerly anticipated. I would point out, if you're not aware already, that the data in here are in fact estimates. And a lot of people only look at the commodity summaries and they never get to the yearbooks. But the yearbook is the permanent record, and any revisions that occur in our data will be in the yearbooks, not necessarily in the commodity summary. So that's something people should keep in mind. Like any other kind of data, particularly government statistics, they get revised frequently as better information becomes available. We try to make sure we update those and get the best information we can into the final record, which is the Mineral Yearbook Series. We also do a lot of special publications, fact sheets, and special scientific and investigative reports, and so on. But this is a very large sort of work portfolio that we produce on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis every year. It is our core mission. It is where the work that results from all of the data collection and consolidation and analysis and description resides in a permanent record. So, to sort of work my way slowly toward critical minerals, which is supposed to be the topic of my discussion here, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of global setting that we are in today that makes us concerned about not only critical minerals, but mineral commodities in general, and specifically the availability of those and the increasing demand for those. I think in many ways, in our view, we are in a historically unprecedented time. We have seen very rapid growth of consumption of mineral commodities of all kinds, dominated in recent time by developments in China. But our expectation is that continued demand growth should, in fact, be anticipated from the rest of the world. Here is just an example going back to 1990. I apologize if it's a little bit difficult to read, but this is iron ore production in millions of metric tons. The red line is China, right? So China has ramped up their own domestic iron ore industry very dramatically since around the turn of the century, as have Australia in blue and Brazil in green. Now, obviously, this material is going into the steel industry, but it's not going into the steel industry in Australia and Brazil. Their steel industries have hardly grown over this period. It's going into the steel industry and has been for more than a decade in China. So all of this really large increase in global capacity for iron ore has gone to fuel the growth of the steel industry in China, and which leads you to this kind of graphic, which gives us the production of raw steel in China since 2000. And in fact, it is equal to the total steel produced in the United States in the entire 20th century, about 7 billion tons. This is an absolutely astounding volume of material. Okay, and this is just one example. I mean, you could go through commodity after commodity after commodity, which is basically what we do in the USGS and MIC, and you see similar kinds of increases in demand. Now, some people say, well, okay, but China is slowing down. Yeah, they are, and it's part of the whole global slowdown in the downturn in the commodity cycle. But China's economy is now 10 trillion. And if it grows at 5%, this is $500 billion a year. So the US economy is around 18, even if we grow at 3%, 2 or 3%. You're still talking about a lot of growth, a lot of demand, and that's just the US and China, right? That's not the rest of the world. So our view is, despite the near-term downturn in commodity prices and the pain and suffering that some of the industry producers are going through now as they restructure and rationalize their operations in view of the current demand, that in the longer term, demand is going to return. We're seeing some supply coming offline now. Demand will catch up with supply, and then it's back into the next cycle. So why do we believe that the long term should convince us that this is true? Really, it's, as Per mentioned, it's population on one level, but the real driver, in our view, is the migration of the world's population into the middle class. That's really what's been happening in China for the last 20 or 25 years, because China had a very large population for decades, and they didn't consume all of those materials. It's really been the economic growth that has brought living standards for large numbers of Chinese up to comparable levels to other developed countries that has driven this increase in consumption. And so, you know, there are various estimates, but these are data from the Brookings Institute. Typically, the estimates range somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 billion people, so let's say 3 on average, who will move from what they define as a lower class or low income to middle class living standards by 2030. This is a huge number of people that will move into the middle class over this period of time. The largest increases will be in Asia. So here's 2009. If you look at 2020, this is what people expect. So large growth of people in middle class in China and other Asian countries, and even more so by 2030. The Middle East, North Africa region growing by a factor of 2 from a relatively low base. North America and Europe basically flat in absolute numbers, but with a shrinking global share of the total middle class population globally. So if economic trends continue the way people are projecting, this is another 3 billion people in you know, less than 20 years who will have middle class expectations about housing and, you know, transportation and communication, all of the things we take for granted in our societies and that are very material intensive. And so if you believe, as I do, that we are already in a global competition for natural resources, the longer term view is that those kinds of issues and competition is going to become more intense. So this is why we are concerned about availability of middle commodities. This is another reason. So technology is growing more and more complex. We all know this. I mean, we all carry very powerful devices on our belt or carry around with us all day. And if you go back a couple of decades, we were using a much smaller part of the periodic table to meet our needs. Now we're using a very large fraction of the materials in the periodic table, which is another reason why we believe that the scope of our activities needs to be broad. Material science continues to advance. You know, more and more commodities and elements are being used in different ways. We believe that that is likely to continue. Okay, so if we get then to what criticality, and people have been talking about criticality and strategic minerals for decades, literally. So the topic is nothing new. There has been a renewed emphasis on it in the past 10 years or so, and so we might think it's new, but it's not actually. But there was a very famous study that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with on minerals, critical minerals in the U.S. economy in 2008 by the National Academy of Sciences. This kind of laid out the sort of basis for much of the work that has followed in critical minerals. And the definition that comes out of that work is one that is pretty widely accepted. It's one that we use as a working definition. It's perfectly serviceable, I think. A mineral can be considered critical if it performs an essential function for which few, if any, substitutes exist, and an assessment indicates a high probability of supply being disrupted, resulting in either physical availability or significantly higher price. That is, significant impacts for consumers of those materials. And they define that quite elegantly with two axes: impact of supply disruption and then supply risk. And a lot of work that's been done since then has built on these kinds of concepts. And there have been lots of studies, including in the European Union, and my focus here is on things that have happened in the US, but lots of people have produced lists. They've produced indexes, methodological refinements. All of this is very good work and I think is important, and it helps focus people's attention on these issues. But in our view, criticality really depends on who is asking the question, okay? So we get asked all the time, well, where's your critical mineral list? Well, I always say, well, who wants to know? I mean, if it's General Electric, not only can they do it themselves, but they have a very different idea of what might be critical than Halliburton or the Department of Defense in the United States. So it really depends on who's asking the questions, and they're likely to come to quite different conclusions depending on who, in fact, is interested in these issues. Department of Energy, for example, focuses on green energy in the United States. This is their thing, so they're interested in wind turbines and next generation solar panels and this sort of thing. The Department of Defense, Defense Logistics Agency, who we work very closely with, is concerned with a strategic mineral stockpile. So a lot of their modeling is based on information that we give them about supply and distribution of supply sources globally, goes into their models. And gives them some insight on what we should be doing in terms of decision making about what kind of materials should be in the strategic stockpile, whether we should buy or sell materials in our strategic stockpile. So these kinds of analyses all depend on data, and usually depend on our data in many instances. Not to blow our own horn, but we do produce a comprehensive set of data that are very useful for these kinds of studies. Further, criticality is not a static thing. You can look at it as a snapshot, but it really doesn't tell you what you need to know about whether you're going to have some commodity or other become a significant risk. These things change over time as availability changes and as new technologies result in increased consumption and new applications. So a long-standing goal of the US government has been the objective of trying to develop a kind of early warning indicator for things that might be becoming a risk for supply and therefore have a significant impact on some sector of the economy or on some aspect of national security. This goes back decades. It's a very difficult thing to do, but in fact we've had a go at it, and I think we're making some progress. We're probably not everywhere. We've not gotten as far as we need to, but we are making progress. So I'm going to talk about some of the elements that we think about when we put together this model. First, net import reliance, which is something that we report every year, that is widely and often misunderstood and miscommunicated. Talk about country concentration of production, governance risk, demand growth, price volatility, and then finally a little bit about conflict minerals, which draws together a number of these different kinds of issues. There are lots of things that you can look at for understanding criticality. These are a few, and I will describe our thought process and the development of the methodology as we go along. But these factors are all in some way influencing whether or not there are risks in our supply chains for the availability of particular mineral commodities. And we've tried to build these into a model that gives us some potential for seeing problems coming before they actually arrive. As I said yesterday in some of my comments to the microgroup, forecasting is notoriously difficult, and often turns out to be wrong. But I think when we look at what we've done, we can see things that we know have happened in the past, where if we were tracking the right metrics, we should have seen that there was something happening and done something about it, or at least brought it to people's attention so something could be done about it. So first, net import reliance. This is a paper that we just released. It happens to be one I wrote, together with John de Jong, who is my predecessor as director of the center, and two of our newer employees. Elizabeth Sanjean is the director, or the section chief for mineral commodities section, and Emily Schnabele is one of our bright young commodity specialists. I have a few reprints of this with me if people are interested, and obviously you can find it on our website. But what we did here was look at the evolution of net import reliance over a 60-year period at discrete points, discrete moments in time, from the post-Second World War through current day in 30-year increments, to see what the pattern is that's been emerging over this period of time. A lot of people talk about net import reliance, and they, and particularly, I think, people who are not scientists automatically assume that because we are dependent on imports, that it's a risk, and that is not true. So we publish every year this very famous graph in the mineral commodity summaries. Lots of people take this and reproduce it, and you know, proclaim that the end of the world is near because we depend on all of these things, imports for all of these commodities. But some of them we really represent no risk at all, right? So arsenic is on this list. Well, you know, the fact that we're 100% net import reliant for arsenic is of no concern to me. I'm not worried about that at all, right? So, you know, just simply interpreting this as an indicator of risk is a simplistic view of things. Now, there are other things on here, such as gallium and tantalum, that do, in our view, represent risks, but you have to view these things in context. But it is a fact, and it gets people very excited, that as we look at this through time, regardless of what category you look at, you know, dependence in the 25 to 50% range, or 50 to 100 or 100%, that each of these categories has been increasing. So the number of commodities and the percent import dependence has been increasing. This is a long-term trend. I'm sure there are similar trends for Europe, right? As we mine less, but still continue to consume, we need to get these materials from somewhere. Increasingly, they're coming from other countries. So we need to understand what's really important about net import reliance and what is simply, you know, background noise. So in our view, you know, it really is not all of the things that are on that list, but specific things that are on that list, and then more importantly, where they're coming from, okay? And this is the look at the geographic breakdown of where these materials have been coming from. Sorry, I should be looking at my pointer, not my advance. Going back to 1954, relatively small number of commodities that we were net import reliant for. And a lot of our supply was in the Western Hemisphere, so Canada and Mexico, Brazil, so certainly South Africa, to a lesser extent Central Africa and Australia. You know, from our perspective, the fact that we're net import reliant on Canada and Mexico is inherently a fairly low risk. These are trade partners, reliable trade partners of ours. They're in NAFTA. We have excellent relationships on trade with them, and very convenient, well-defined logistics routes. So from a high level, that is something that concerns us much less than some other things that we might look at. If we go to the middle point of our range in 1984, and we go back and forth from 54 to 84, you see again Canada, Mexico, Western Hemisphere, but increasingly more in Australia, at the time the USSR, and China in the midpoint of our range. So our supply chain already 30 years ago was starting to broaden out significantly in the geographic distribution of where we are sourcing our materials. We go to the current day, and the situation has moved still further in that direction. We still get a lot of commodities from the Western Hemisphere, particularly Canada and Mexico. But increasingly, we rely for many materials on China, as many do many other countries. In this period of time, they have become not only the largest supplier of many commodities, but the largest consumer. It's had a profound impact on supply and demand globally. And so Our number of commodities that we are dependent on, and these are all for 50% or greater, so it includes 100%. Everything that's 50% or greater net import reliance has shifted dramatically to Asia, particularly China, much less now in Central Africa, still significantly in the Western Hemisphere, which is good. But this is really, again, is only part of the story. It depends really, net import reliance really depends on what type of material you're talking about. And as an example, I would offer, for example, potash. It's an important agricultural fertilizer, very difficult to replace that. Potassium as a critical nutrient. We get 84% of our supply of potash from Canada. Is this a risk? No, I don't really think so. We have a very reliable trade partner, well-established logistics, and by the way, we also have very large resources and reserves in the United States. So if tomorrow suddenly we couldn't get any potash from Canada, we could mine it ourselves. So the risk for something like that is very low, even though the net import reliance has been increasing steadily over time. It's really an economic issue. It's not that we don't have it, and so it doesn't really constitute a risk. So you really have to filter this kind of information in a different way, rather than just looking at whether you're importing or not, because it doesn't really tell you the whole story. So just to summarize that piece, it's not necessarily an indication of supply risk. It's the type of commodity and the source country that are important in evaluating whether it's a risk or not. We do have a long-term trend toward greater number of commodities and a higher percentage of net import reliance. This gives a lot of people discomfort, and they feel that we need to do something about it. That's a policy decision. I don't get to decide that. I supply facts that allow people to make those kinds of decisions. We have had an increasingly global, and we continue to have an increasingly global geographic distribution of the countries that we're relying on for these materials. And we do report these every year in the mineral commodity summaries, and we will continue to do so. So let's look at country concentration for production, and the way people normally do this is with the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So you sum the squares of the country's share of production of a commodity, and when you express the share as a fraction, this index approaches 1 for highly concentrated production and 0 for widely distributed production. So this is something that lots of people use, often using our data to define it for a particular commodity. But you can sum up the contributions from different producing countries and get an index that is an indication of how concentrated the supply is for that material. So the RAND National Defense Research Institute did this a couple years ago and published this, I think, in 2013, probably 2011 data in 13, and looked specifically at percentages of global production for mining of key materials that were concentrated within a single country. Right? So these are pie charts of commodities where production is 50% or greater in one country. And they've identified which country that is underneath these pie charts. And the only country that has more than one entry on this list is, in fact, China. You've got cobalt in DRC. These are all China. You've got niobium in Brazil, platinum group elements in South Africa, rhenium in Chile. But all the others are China, which again gives a lot of people some concern. For a number of reasons, and it's not necessarily that we think the Chinese are bad guys. They have very large domestic needs, and they will do what is in their national interest. You can be sure about that. Virtually any country would do that. And so if you have very large domestic demand, then it makes sense that you ramp up your own domestic industry and that you increasingly go outside of your own country's borders for what you need that you have in deficit. So what they're doing is completely rational and consistent with their national interests. So we can, of course, lots of people have done this, and we can do it too. It's all our data. And so we've done that. This is for 2013. And then things like yttrium is leading the top of the list because it's heavily concentrated in China. But then you see a lot of the usual suspects. We did not exclude production concentrated in the US, where we produce most of the world's beryllium. But things like niobium pop up on this list, the rare earths pop on this list. And the rare earths probably, we could look at other slices through time and see that rare earths were higher before, but in 13 it reflects the coming online of Molycorp and Lynas as alternative suppliers to China. And that's something I'll talk more about in a minute. But it's very easy to do this. The data are there. The methodology, I think, is well understood and widely used. You can also look at it in a periodic table for a given year. Again, this is for 2013, highlighting the numbers and colors, and so patterns can jump out at you. We also look, in addition to so elements representing minerals or metals or whatever commodity we're tracking, we also look at some categories that don't fit neatly into one of these boxes, like ferroalloys, for example, where we also have information. You can calculate the same kinds of things. But getting back to my earlier point about that this is not a static issue, okay? Nothing is static about these things. I mean, you saw in the earlier slides the tremendous change in production and consumption for iron ore. Across the board, you see this in almost every commodity. And so what we really need to do is the philosophy we've adopted for the model we're developing, is to look at this in a time series, okay? You really need to be looking at trends. Looking at a single year only shows you what's happening in that year. You don't know what happened the year before, you don't know what happened, and you don't know what happened 5 or 10 years before. So if you think about how am I gonna try to understand changes in the supply chain that should make me ask questions about what's going on, unless I look in a time series. You have to look at the trends. You have to see what direction demand is going. You have to see what direction concentration of production is going. And so when you look at this, and you can probably tell from these slides that I hired somebody from Tom Gradel's group at Yale. Nadal Nasser has joined us over the summer and has done a lot of the modeling work that we're talking about here. But and also one of the real strengths of the Yale group is the ability to, in a single slide, in an amazing graphic, convey an immense amount of information. So you can look at what's your favorite element? If you like gallium, clearly something is happening with gallium here. Something is happening with germanium. So you're looking at a time series going back to 1996 for primary production or production of these various commodities. So this is very powerful, right? And it starts to give us some insight about how we might look for things that are potentially warnings that something is happening in the supply chain that could turn into a significant risk for us, right? So that's one piece of this. Now, it's not obviously just country concentration. As I said before, it really depends on what country and how reliable their ability is to supply you, or alternately, how confident you are that they're going to continue to be able to supply you. So you can look at, in this case, these are World Bank numbers for the worldwide governance indicators in different categories. So basically, we just sum these all up for a given year, and then we can do the same kind of thing that we did with production, look at it in a time series. So in our case, we used a multiplicative approach. Others have done differences. I think the RAND study was a difference between the production concentration and governance index. But I mean, you see when you do this for a particular year, and this is for 13, where the hotspots are. So Central Africa, certainly, DRC, the Middle East, pretty much where you'd expect. And then the very low risk areas, so basically where we're not doing any mining, or not as much mining anymore in the US and Europe. But then, you got folks that we feel like, we can rely on, like our colleagues in Australia, where you have very stable governance and where you have lots of mineral industry concentrated, as well as Canada, where there's still a lot of mining and they're a very reliable source of supply. So again, you can look at this in a snapshot, but it doesn't really tell you it tells you what's happening at the moment in time that you're looking at, but it doesn't really tell you the trends. And so when we multiply these together, production and governance risk, as many others have done, but look at it in a time series, then you see, again, patterns. So for cobalt, clearly something is happening with the cobalt supply. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Again, you still see, the signal is dampened, but you still see large changes, for example, in gallium and germanium, and many others, bismuth. Some things remain kind of uniformly high, others kind of go up and down, but others, there are clear trends over time that really should be telling you something is happening here. And it's something that ultimately will affect or may affect your ability to continue to source these materials. So that's one of the metrics that we are using, and we're looking at it in a time series to try to pick out these trends. You can also go, and I'm not going to go into detail on all of the pieces of the model, in part because it's still a work in progress. This is work we did for the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is the President's scientific advisory group. And the report is currently being reviewed by them. It will probably be issued, I hope, sometime this quarter. And then we will publish the methodology in a peer-reviewed journal after that. But we also want to look at things that in some way can relate to the importance of these materials for a wide variety of uses. And this is difficult to do, okay? In particular, it's difficult to do if you want to do it so that you can update it every year, right? So you have this really very difficult balance to strike that we feel we need to strike in order to be able to do this effectively. It doesn't do any good to say, 5 years from now, we might have a problem coming with this if the problem has already arrived, right? You need to be able to do it in a forward-looking way. And that means that you need to be able to look at things that give you a significant signal, right, that actually means something, but that are simple enough that the data are available and you can collect it every year. And our view is that we need to update this every year. And we need to build it into our regular annual mineral information collection and processing cycle and update the metrics that we're tracking and track the trend as we go forward in time. And realistically, this is a difficult thing to do, especially if you wait for the final numbers. We don't necessarily have to do that. We can use our estimates that we publish in the mineral commodity summaries. We know those numbers before anybody else in the world because we're collecting them. And so we can track these things and we can add to the database, update our model, and look to see what has changed from the prior year, what has changed over a period of years, 5, 10 years, and look for indications that suggest that a problem is coming, and then focus our attention on a smaller subset of commodities in the next cycle for further detailed analysis. This is our proxy, if you will, for so increases in demand and therefore an indication of the potential impact. And it is very much a proxy, I think, not a direct indication. But I mean, as a practical matter, companies do not just produce commodities endlessly if there's no demand. I mean, these materials are being consumed. If you're a business, you don't just build inventory endlessly because it's tying up cash. Nobody runs their business that way. So these materials are being produced, and changes in demand reflect underlying importance of those commodities to a whole variety of different sectors of the economy and national security. So we're using this as a proxy, and the numbers that go into this are our world production data from the mineral yearbook chapters, including estimates that we put into the mineral commodity summaries. So again, it's our data. We're collecting it, and so we have better insight on it than anybody because we're the ones doing it. We get it before anybody else, so we can use it effectively. But then we publish it and make it public at the appointed time, and then others are certainly welcome to use it. So again, if you look at these things, you can see patterns. Gallium and germanium still with demand, clearly big changes there, and some other things up and down. So you get a different kind of signal than the supply risk thing that we were looking at before. And really what we're after here is not necessarily something that is absolutely definitive and describing something as critical, but is another kind of indication that we can look at, either as a component or as a part of a larger metric that combines all of these factors and gives us a picture of things that are happening in the supply chain. We also are looking at market dynamics as measured by price volatility. So price tells you something, again, about what's happening in the supply chain. If you see price whipsawing around up and down over a period of a few years, then you know that you're having periodic shortages or other issues that are causing price to gyrate around, which should be a warning signal that in fact something's happening that you should be paying attention to. And again, you see lots of interesting patterns in these data that are focusing our attention on specific commodities because of signals that we're seeing here, and I'll show you a few examples of some of those in a moment. But this is another indicator that we can look at in a time series. In this case, the price data are not ours. We report price in our publications, in the commodity summaries. Typically, these are annual averages. Right? Price data is, sometimes difficult to come by. There are lots of different sources, lots of different timescales. We usually look at it on an annual average basis. And really what we're interested in is volatility, right? So it's less important that you get the absolute number right than whether you know it's going up and down. The volatility is what is the indicator here that something is going on that you should be paying attention to. And again, we can look at different parts of the supply chain to the extent we push down the supply chain. And as a general issue, the further you go down the supply chain, the less information you actually have. On the mining and mineral processing end of things, we and other groups, I think, do a fairly good job. If you get beyond our data and start looking at specific metals and compounds and chemicals, the data are much less available. We would like to do something about that, but that's another subject entirely. So then you can combine all of these together into a criticality indicator that puts them all together and then sort of ranks them. And so people that want a list, we can give them a list. In my view, it's not as useful as looking at trends and trying to decide which of these we want to look at in closer detail. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, so let me just check here. Yeah, I probably am going to talk way too long, but apologize for that. Again, so this is what the overall metric looks like in a time series. So let's just look at some examples before I completely use up my allotted time. So a lot of the recent interest in critical minerals and criticality is a result of events around the crisis in rare earth supply in 2010. This is the longer term trend for production for rare earths, and you see China here in the dark blue, obviously coming up very strongly since 1990. The US used to be a major supplier, but as China increasingly became the world's dominant supplier, Molycorp no longer had a viable business model and they shut down. There were some other smaller producers. They basically all gotten pinched out by China. We know the story well by now. The price is shown here. See the spike when the Chinese decided that maybe they wouldn't export as much of these to Japan and the rest of the world, and caused a crisis that spiked the price and got everybody worried once again about critical minerals. What are we going to do? So it's sort of past time for us to actually get serious about this in our view. So let's look at what our metrics tell us. If we look back in our data, we've pushed it back to 1996. We'd like to go back a bit further, but we're back to 96 now. So it captures, really the events in China, I think, fairly well. But this is the supply risk metric here, and so it increased by a factor of 2 already back in the 90s, right? And it was very high for most of the first decade of the 20th century, and then it dropped off after the crisis when Molycorp and Linus came online. So a bit more diversity in supply here, and it's reflected very clearly in our metric. But we would argue that if we were tracking this metric back in the mid-90s, that we would have seen this. And I'm not saying that we would have actually done anything about it, but we absolutely would have brought it to people's attention. Hey, this metric, which in hindsight we know can lead to unfortunate circumstances or outcomes for us, we know that. Knowing that, if you see this kind of increase in production concentration, it should give you a warning that, hey, something is happening here, we better understand what it is, and we better understand if it's a risk for us. Right, so this is the whole idea here. So when you look at the other metrics, so price, sorry, I'm trying to catch the laser here. Price actually, here's the spike when the crisis occurred, but price was actually increasing from a pretty low level by more than a factor of 2 or 3 in the period leading up to that period. So again, price volatility is telling us something that if we were paying attention to it, the signal is attenuated a bit, but it's still telling us something pretty significant about price well before it became a crisis. So again, if you see this kind of a pattern in a commodity, it should make you think, I better understand what's going on here. Something's happening that is driving this, and it's important to understand what that is. We don't see as much in the demand metric and the overall criticality, although the criticality index overall is higher, but it's not definitive. It's really the supply risk and then the price volatility. And this differs for different commodities that we look at. Sometimes we get a better signal from one or the other, which we think is one of the advantages of looking at a variety of metrics to try to understand these things. So we're going to take another example. If you remember the periodic tables, you maybe saw something going on with bismuth. Well, again, there's something that's going on with bismuth is an increasing concentration of mine production in China. Right, so you see that here since the turn of the century. So we get a similar kind of country concentration governance risk curve going here with bismuth, which we are increasingly net import reliant for in the US and for which there is demand growth as a substitute for lead and in a variety of different applications. So we're seeing a signal here that again should focus our attention, on this case in bismuth. Right, so and I don't remember if I got, no, we've got to go back to this one. So if you look at the metrics, we see that reflected very clearly in our supply risk metric going back over time. So steadily, so more or less steady here, but then in recent years, ramping up quite strongly. And then the overall criticality metric following that, because it's being driven very strongly in this case by the supply risk indicator. This is price, right? So we had a price spike. Again, should be telling us, hey, something's happening here. We need to pay attention. And not so much in the demand metric, but again, this is another example. And so there are a number of other examples that you can look at. So, for example, here are the rare earths, and again, the signal going down for the supply risk metric from a high level after the crisis, and this reflects Linus and Molycor again. This is likely to tick back up when we start to look at 2014, 2015. Molycor is on care and maintenance. The real issue, in our view, is not that we don't have good deposits of rare earths elsewhere in the globe. It is that nobody really has a viable business model for producing rare earths outside of China. You wanted to ask a question, Daniel? Oh, okay. Looked like you had a question. Hopefully, if I don't talk too long, we'll have some time for some questions at the end. So then here's bismuth again. Increased production in bismuth, mined bismuth. Platinum has been pretty flat. Here is country concentration, supply, or governance risk in the DRC for cobalt. So we're looking at cobalt in one of our deep dives now, in part because of this, and in part because of other things that people have told us. So we're looking carefully at cobalt. So we're using this model to say, hey, we need to understand what's going on here. We know the sort of headline cause is concentration in DRC. That clearly has some implications for risk to the global supply chain. And so that was the last one. See a little uptick in tantalum. I'm going to talk more about tantalum in a minute. I promise I'm coming to near the end. Just wanted to mention conflict minerals. In the US, we had the Dodd-Frank Act, which some of you may be familiar with, that requires companies to do due diligence on their supply chains to try to understand whether materials are getting into their supply chains from conflict zones in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they are being mined under the control of armed groups. and is something that, from a societal point of view, is not something we want to encourage. The Department of Commerce, and specifically the Securities and Exchange Commission, was tasked by Congress in this bill to produce a list of conflict mineral processors. That's a very difficult thing to do. And so they came to us and asked us if we could produce a list of conflict mineral processors. And we said, no, we can't. But we can tell you who globally can process tantalum, tungsten, and tin, and gold. We don't know whether the flows into those plants are legal or illegal, but we can tell you who processes them. And if you know the point in the supply chain where it's the last point before the identity of those materials is lost, you have some chance of tracing it back to the origin. And so we provided these lists to Commerce and the SEC. State Department was also very interested in this. But we also did a series of fact sheets that captured this information in a schematic map and tables of global mineral processing facilities, of which we maintain a database for global processing of virtually all the commodities we track. We're in the process of updating this and upgrading our ability to map these things. Which leads me to my final slide here, or my final graphic slide, to talk about what we see as a nexus between conflict minerals and critical minerals, and that is tantalum. There's been a lot of attention to tantalum in the US. The US Congress, the Defense Logistics Agency, the Government Accountability Office have all been asking lots of questions about tantalum, and with good reason. Again, if we look at a time series, and this isn't a fact sheet that just came out in December, so if you want to look at this in more detail, you can go to our website. It's on our featured publications front page. But if you go from the year 2000 up to present day, through 2014, more or less present day, you've seen a huge shift in the distribution of production from Australia and Brazil around the turn of the century. Rwanda and the DRC are down here. And as we move forward toward present day, a very large increase in production in Rwanda and DRC. So DRC is obviously a Dodd-Frank country. All of the countries that border the DRC are Dodd-Frank countries. So Rwanda, Burundi are on this list. And increasingly, supply of tantalum is coming from the DRC, Rwanda, and other African countries in close proximity. There's also been a very large shift from industrial processing, large industrial companies, to artisanal mining over here, and to shift companies with higher governance risk. So not only have we sort of the large mining operations in transparent countries where it's easy for us to get information, but to countries where it's not easy for us to get information and where production is very largely disseminated through artisanal mining. So an inherently more difficult problem to solve in terms of where materials are coming from, particularly if you're trying to track whether they're illegal or legal. And so it presents a really profound challenge. So this prompted us to do this fact sheet and also a full material flow analysis, which will be published in parts in peer-reviewed journals over the course of this year, looking at all the trade flows and quantifying to the extent we can. There are a lot of, and people that looked at trade data probably know, there are lots of gaps in trade data, inconsistent reporting, things getting categorized or lumped together. Very difficult sometimes to parse those data and say, well, this is just tantalum. Because oftentimes it's lumped in with niobium and other things, and it's hard to deconvolute those. But these are the kinds of problems that we need to be able to solve, because tantalum obviously is in everybody's smartphone. So if you don't have some tantalum on you, I would be very surprised. So if I can just sum up, and hopefully have some time for questions, about our view on criticality, the metrics and the methodology we're developing. Obviously supply risk is the classic that everybody looks at. The difference is that, we're looking at this as a time series. This is really key in our view, to understanding whether there is a higher probability that you're going to have a problem with some particular commodity. Growth in demand with our global production as a proxy. We produce all of these data aside from the governance risk. The price volatility is the data that we obtain commercially and through other sources. But overall, a lot of these data are based on our own data collection and some other key sources. But analyzing them in trends is the key to really understanding what's happening. And our view is that we need to update these annually. And this is obviously a lot of work, but it's the kind of work that we already do. And so we feel like we are best positioned to be able to do this in an effective way and provide real fact-based input to other government agencies and other users of our data, including our colleagues in other countries, because this is publicly available data. And once OSTP has approved this report, the methodology will be published and will be in the public domain, assuming that people don't decide it needs to be classified in some way, and I don't think it will be. None of the work we've done up to now has been classified. And as I said before, and this is a really important point, because a lot of people have looked at criticality in very fine detail. And Tom Grado's group at Yale is a very good example. They've done excellent work looking at all of the different kinds of factors that can have an impact on criticality. But in a lot of cases, those data are not available in a timely way and something that you can update annually. So there are big gaps in data, there are delays in when you can get the data. So our ability to do that kind of in real time is severely restricted if we take that approach. I think it's a very powerful approach for looking at in detail at individual commodities. But if we want to do this in an annual cycle and get a kind of big picture view of what's happening across a broad spectrum of commodities globally, we need to do it in a way that balances the need for having complexity enough that gives you some rigor and convinces you that you've got a signal that actually means something, and simplicity, which basically comes down to availability of data. So that is my final slide, and so I will stop and take questions.